Hello, today I'm returning to a brief discussion on Final Fantasy, with a look at the top 5 minigames that I believe features in the series. Now, as usual, I'm going to try and balance, or at least qualify my personal suggestions, with an objective criteria as to what I think makes a good minigame, and why they succeed more than others. And to jump right in, I think first and foremost, enjoyability and having a certain replay value associated with a minigame is more often than not an important, if not the most important factor of a minigame, because of course these are optional tasks. There needs to be some incentive for players to want to go and do them, and enjoyability is a component of that. Secondly, I think bound to that replay value and a desire to play, there would need to be an escalation and reward mechanism included. So the better you perform, or the harder the challenge you overcome, you earn increasingly better rewards for doing so. And finally, I suppose linking to that point, mini-games that can benefit your progress and have a real terms payoff in the actual game itself. So whether that's unlocking a cool weapon or a rare item, for example, ultimate weapons are a recurring one, or buffing stats for your characters, stuff like that, all of which serves to incentivize the play of a minigame, encourage a player to deviate from the central story, to play these minigames, and once again emphasize that replay value and the desirability of the game itself. So with that in mind, here's a top 5 for Final Fantasy minigames that I feel answer some or all of these criteria. And of course I'm happy to have discussion and hear other suggestions for those that think otherwise. Now, kicking off with a minigame that's found across a number of Final Fantasies is the recurring instance of the Battle Arena, or the Colosseum, where party members, or more often than not a single party member, is pitted against monsters that recur within the main game. And while this appears in several Final Fantasies, with varying degrees of quality, for the purposes of this discussion, I'll focus on Final Fantasy VII, the Battle Square, and also the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Corneo's Colosseum, which is something of a milder adaptation of the Battle Square. Although I will say, several other Final Fantasy games do this really well. For example, Final Fantasy X, the way they implemented the monster arena, I thought was fantastic, and it is quite hard to choose favourites, but I'm going with these. So regarding the Battle Square in Final Fantasy VII, this rendition of the classic battle arena was interesting in how it added high stakes and high reward to the gameplay by having each successive battle feature a player handicap, such as halving your health, casting frog, disabling magic, and so on. And while this was undoubtedly a source of frustration for many, and added a huge component of luck to the ordeal, which, generally speaking, adding in a luck-based game doesn't fare well within video games, because the basis of their appeal is in part player aptitude and the player performing well. I think it did ultimately pay off, because firstly, the rewards were comparatively huge in the Battle Square, with the Omni/Limit Break and the W-Summon materia being among the top prizes that you could get. And unlike many minigames, the Battle Square didn't necessarily rely on a single perfect run to acquire the top prizes, but rather successive decent playthroughs to earn battle points would ultimately be traded for top prizes. So much like earning gil from regular combat, the reward system of the Battle Square in Final Fantasy VII proper was accumulative rather than instant, and I quite liked that. You didn't necessarily need to survive through the whole thing, but the better you performed meant you would have to do it less times to get a top prize, for example. Regarding the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Corneo's Colosseum, it was simultaneously much more varied, yet also more constrained in other areas too. For example, you could have a solo playthrough or a team playthrough, and these different arrangements of combat scenario. But rather than fighting a wide range of enemies, the options were quite limited compared to other Final Fantasies, such as 9, 10, and so on, and their arenas. However, as I discussed in my Final Fantasy VII Remake review, I felt the combat, both the action-based and the turn-based forms of combat in the remake, were really good. They were excellent, in fact, really fun to play. So the opportunity to indulge this a little bit more and earn relatively good rewards for doing so was a great addition to the game. And while I've got no idea if subsequent installments of the remake will adopt and synchronize with existent game elements like the battle arena, I would love to see greater scope for this on the horizon. And it would be great to see them adopt some form of arena or battle square in future instalments, whether that's the Gold Saucer, a return to Kaneo's mansion, or whatever. Moving on, the next minigame I'd like to discuss is fishing in Final Fantasy XV. And this was interesting in how it not only had the escalating stakes and reward mechanisms in place, although I would suggest that the rewards for fishing aren't as big as other Final Fantasy minigames, because really, rather than an ultimate weapon or a rare item or limit breaks or stuff like that, the rewards for fishing mostly provide ability leveling for Noctis and ingredients, food ingredients for Ignis. However, despite that, I would say that fishing really validates the open world and the explorative nature of Final Fantasy XV, and rather than being situated in a single place like the Battle Square or Chocobo Racing and stuff like that in earlier games, it really encourages exploration and engagement with the world to find unique fishing spots and the rarer types of fish that reside within these. It also requires player input with in-game vendors and unlockables, because fishing equipment is essential to catching different calibers of fish, and getting decent equipment is really important to sort of progressing through this minigame. And so there's an entire ecosystem of exploration, purchase, customization that goes into Noctis's fishing hobby, and I really quite like that. And perhaps the reward system and the incentive could have been a bit better, but the game itself was a really kind of addictive, interesting reprieve from the main action of Final Fantasy XV, and quite fun to do. The third minigame that I've ranked here is Final Fantasy X's Blitzball, and after a couple of Final Fantasies that indulged card games as the main form of minigame that sat alongside the story, Final Fantasy X really went all out and departed from these kind of micro minigames with what in hindsight we can appreciate as really quite an ambitious sports game that allowed us to build a team, play through leagues, win prizes, and had a real payoff in the main game too, specifically in the form of being able to unlock Wakka's limit breaks and a component of his ultimate weapon. And while I know some people disliked Blitzball because it was quite slow-paced, and they would have preferred it to be a more action-like, I suppose, a kind of FIFA or football game, for example, which I can understand to some degree, because each match is 10 minutes long, with a suspension of play each time a character handles the ball. So I can appreciate they are lengthy sort of mini-games to partake in. But also, I think the ability to recruit characters from around Spira, build up your customised optimal team, boost their movesets and level their statistics and all of that sort of thing. It was a really cool means of play, and again, like the fishing minigame, Blitzball is an entire ecosystem away from the main story that you could get lost in for hours if you choose to do so. And again, it really did have these legitimate rewards of boosting Wakka's abilities, so I think it definitely sits within the top 5 for me. Moving on to the penultimate minigame here, which I think endures in the popular consciousness of Final Fantasy fans, is the GBike challenge of Final Fantasy VII. And this is momentous for a number of reasons, as much for its context in the game as the actual enjoyment of the gameplay itself. Firstly, I think in a roundabout way it contributed to the enduring legacy of Cloud Strife as a super cool character, and seeing the cutscene of him exiting the Shinra HQ on the motorcycle is a lasting visual and FMV of the original title. Secondly, I think while many Final Fantasy games had mini-games up to this point, Final Fantasy VII had several which aligned in-game with real-world narrative moments, such as snowboarding, chocobo racing, and so on, all being prerequisites to progress the story, before they became optional aspects of the Gold Saucer, for example. And GBike is no exception to this, and is perhaps the most important among these, because it precipitates the escape from Midgar. It is the climactic moment of leaving the lengthy confines of this opening dungeon and the gloomy slums, and taking us out into the open world of the initial continent. So it was a very pivotal and momentous moment of the game too, so I think it stands out for that reason. But beyond this, I think the challenge of the game, the much more action-orientated gameplay within this ostensibly turn-based title, was a welcome change for some players. And while it did have rewards in terms of GP at the Gold Saucer, I think it was also a reward unto itself for many players who wanted to beat their high score and come through the playthrough as unscathed as possible. So it was a very concise and addictive little game, action-orientated game that I enjoyed there. Now, moving on to the final minigame, which I think takes the best of these that we've discussed thus far, and really matches with the criteria that I outlaid in the beginning, is the Triple Triad card game from Final Fantasy VIII. And for me, this game really succeeds for numerous reasons. Firstly, thinking about minigames being concise and having replay value, I think Triple Triad certainly does, since each game lasts between 30 seconds to 2 minutes tops for most people. So unlike Blitzball, for example, the time investment is actually quite minimal, and the means of play is quite intuitive, engaging and quick. The risk to reward ratio is also high, since there are tiers of acquirable cards that vary in value from enemy and boss cards all the way up to summon and player cards. And it's almost like Pokemon and other card games where you can collect them all for the sake of collecting them if you choose to. But the challenging aspect is firstly acquiring decent enough cards to start developing a win streak, and secondly, the more you play and the further afield that you play, the element of chance plays a role, since the rules can change depending on what region you are in or what region you've been to. And so while you may be acquiring better cards as you progress, the handicap introduced is things like sudden death or same plus rules and so on. So it really ensures that the playing field is quite even and the challenge is always there as you go on. Beyond this, and as mentioned before, minigames are perhaps at their best when they synergize with paying off with the main game and actually rewarding your characters in the main party. And the rewards from Triple Triad can be pretty huge, since you can refine these cards into rare items and magic, which has massive implications on your player stats and your abilities. And for example, on my first ever playthrough of Final Fantasy VIII, I acquired the Laguna card from Alone in Space, which can refine into 100 hero drinks, which makes you invincible. And that's literally how I beat the game. That's how I defeated Ultimisia in the final battle. I just kept giving my party members hero drinks, and they never took any damage. So big rewards there, and a very fun card game, in my opinion. Finally, as with Blitzball and fishing, exploration is key, and playing certain characters is integral to acquiring certain cards. And so it's actually quite fun to run around the world, engage with these characters, and unlock certain cards. And there's actually a side quest or mini-game within this mini-game, which is the Card King side quest, where you adventure around Balam Garden, playing certain characters to unlock certain cards and finding out who the Card King is. So that's always a fun little one to work through when you're taking a break from the main story. So for me, the consistent challenge and reward, along with the concise and addictive nature of Triple Triad, sees it win out among these Final Fantasy minigames. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below, letting me know your thoughts on your favourite Final Fantasy minigames. And please consider sharing, subscribing, and checking the description below for more episodes and details about how you can support the channel.